Story 1. The hotel room that unlocked at 3 a.m. I used to think hotels were places of refuge, temporary sanctuaries for weary travelers. I had stayed in dozens, maybe hundreds, throughout my career as a traveling consultant, and though I had seen my fair share of creaky hallways, flickering lights, and old carpets that smelled faintly of mildew, nothing had ever truly unnerved me. That changed one autumn night in 2018 when I checked into a hotel off the interstate in Kentucky. It wasn't anything remarkable, just one of those mid-priced chains, neither luxurious nor seedy. The lobby had the faint scent of lemon cleaner and stale coffee, and the front desk clerk barely looked up from her computer as she handed me my key card. Room 407. Fourth floor. End of the hall. The day had been long, filled with meetings, a delayed flight, and an hour-long drive in pouring rain. By the time I dragged my suitcase into the elevator, exhaustion had settled into my bones. The hallway was dim, illuminated by the kind of yellow light that makes shadows cling to corners. The carpet muffled my footsteps as I reached my room. When I slid the key card, the lock clicked. I pushed open the door and was greeted with the usual scene. 2 queen beds with scratchy white linens, a desk pushed up against the wall, a mounted TV, a closet I'd never use. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I dropped my suitcase, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the nearest bed. I must have drifted in and out of sleep for an hour before I finally got up to brush my teeth and change clothes. I remember double-checking the door. Out of habit, I always tug the handle twice to ensure the deadbolt is secure. I heard it click firmly into place. Satisfied, I slid beneath the stiff hotel sheets and let the exhaustion pull me under. When I woke, it was dark. Not the comfortable darkness of early morning, but that disorienting blackness that makes you feel like the world has folded in on itself. My phone glowed faintly on the nightstand, and I reached for it. 2:59 a.m. That's when I heard it. A click. The sound was sharp, distinct, unmistakable. The sound of the lock turning. At first, my groggy mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a noise from the hallway, another door shutting, or the pipes clanging. But then, slowly, the handle of my own door depressed. The latch rattled, and the door pushed inward. I froze. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to shout, to do something. But all I could do was stare at the thin line of light from the hallway spilling across the carpet. The door opened just wide enough for a shadow to fall into the room. Then it stopped. Someone or something was standing just outside. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. No answer. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I could hear my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Whoever was there hadn't moved, hadn't stepped inside, hadn't closed the door. It was as if they were waiting, lingering at the threshold. Summoning what little courage I had, I scrambled for the phone on the nightstand and switched on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light cut across the room, but when I aimed it at the doorway, there was nothing. No figure. Just the door, ajar. I got up, legs trembling, and inched toward it. I pulled the door fully open, shining the light into the empty hallway. The carpet stretched in both directions, silent and still. Not a soul in sight. I shut the door quickly and threw the deadbolt. Then I dragged the desk chair across the room and wedged it under the handle. Only when I had done that did I crawl back into bed, but sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the building, every distant thump made me flinch. At 3:17 a.m., it happened again. The handle jiggled. Slowly at first, then with more force, as though someone was deliberately testing the barrier. The chair rattled against the door, legs scraping against the carpet. My breath caught in my throat. I sat upright, gripping the phone like a lifeline, and in a burst of adrenaline, I shouted, "I'm calling the police!" The noise stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the jiggling, because it meant whoever or whatever was outside had heard me. They were real. Minutes crawled by like hours. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to call the front desk. My voice shook as I explained that someone was trying to get into my room. The clerk sounded skeptical at first, but she promised to send security up. When the guard arrived, he knocked 3 times before announcing himself. I opened the door cautiously. He was an older man, heavy-set, with tired eyes. He inspected the hallway, checked the lock, and assured me that no one had been seen on the floor. "Sometimes these electronic locks glitch," he said with a shrug. "Could have unlocked on its own." But locks don't just turn by themselves. I asked if I could switch rooms. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. They moved me to room 412, 2 doors down. I packed my things in a rush, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting the door to swing open again. In the new room, I repeated the same ritual. Checked the lock, wedged the chair, turned on the TV for background noise. Still, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the building sounded amplified. Every gust of wind outside seemed like a whisper against the walls. The next morning, I checked out early. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just wanted out of that place. When the clerk asked how my stay was, I muttered something vague and hurried to my car. It's been years since that night, but I can still hear the sound of the lock clicking open at 3 a.m. clear as day. I can still see the sliver of hallway light stretching into my room. And sometimes, when I'm traveling for work, standing outside yet another hotel door with a key card in my hand, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked the deadbolt, if I hadn't wedged the chair under the handle. I wonder who or what would have stepped inside. Story 2. The childhood bedroom door that wouldn't stay shut. When I was a child, the bedroom I grew up in had an odd quirk. The door, an old wooden slab with a brass knob that had dulled from years of use, never seemed to stay shut. No matter how carefully I pulled it closed, no matter how hard I twisted the knob to latch it tight, I would wake up at night to find it cracked open just enough for the hallway's dim light to spill through. At first, it seemed like nothing more than poor carpentry in a house built decades before I was born. But over time, that door became the centerpiece of memories that still send shivers down my spine. The first memory that stands out happened when I was about 8. My parents tucked me into bed, kissed me goodnight, and pulled the door closed with their usual care. I watched it click into place, the kind of click you feel certain about, the sound that says, yes, it's locked into the frame. But not long after my parents' footsteps faded down the hall, I heard it, the creak of hinges. Slowly, deliberately, the door opened wide enough that I could see the shadowed hallway outside. I thought my mom had come back to check on me. So I whispered, "Mom?" No one answered. The hallway remained empty. Still, I climbed out of bed, my little legs trembling with the dread only children can feel. I closed the door again, even pressed my weight against it until I heard the knob click. This time, I decided to stay awake. I sat in bed, staring at the faint outline of the door in the moonlight streaming through my window. Minutes passed. My heart began to calm. And then, it creaked open again, inch by inch, without a hand on the knob. By then, I was too terrified to leave the safety of my bed. I pulled the blanket over my head and begged sleep to take me. The next morning, the door stood wide open, as if mocking me for thinking I could control it. I told my parents, of course. They dismissed it. The house is old, my dad explained. The frame isn't level. Doors shift, they open by themselves. My mother suggested maybe I wasn't pulling it hard enough. I wanted to believe them. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. It became a ritual. Every night, the door would open. Sometimes I would wake to find it halfway ajar. Other times, it stood fully open, as though someone had swung it wide to walk through. But no matter how I tried to secure it, leaning chairs against it, even tying a belt from the knob to the desk, it always found a way to give. The strangest part wasn't just that the door wouldn't stay shut. It was what I started to hear when it opened. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the wooden floorboards of the hallway, then stopping just outside the crack in my door. They never entered, never crossed into my room. They only waited, breathing. I swear, some nights I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, steady, heavy, right on the other side of that thin wooden barrier. When I was about 10, something happened that etched itself into me permanently. It was winter, and the house was cold enough that I slept under layers of blankets. That night, the door stayed shut longer than usual. I remember thinking maybe it had finally given up, that the warped frame had frozen it tight. But around 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of the knob turning. Not the creak of wood, not the usual slow give of the door. No, the knob was twisting. I could hear the metal scraping, feel the weight of someone or something trying to open it. The knob turned, released, turned again. Then came a faint tap on the wood, 3 sharp knocks in perfect rhythm. Tap, tap, I froze, clutching the blanket to my face. My mind screamed for me to run to my parents, but my body refused to move. I stared at the door, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. Slowly, the door opened again, a gap wide enough for the hallway's shadow to seep in. And in that moment, I saw it, something darker than the shadows, standing just beyond the crack. A figure. Tall, still, faceless in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It only stood there, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. I shut my eyes and prayed until the morning sun streamed into my room. When I finally told my parents again, they grew uneasy. They admitted they had noticed the door too, how it never stayed shut, no matter how firmly they closed it when checking on me. My father even replaced the knob and rehung the door. For one night, it seemed fixed. Then, just as before, it began opening again. The years passed, but the memories lingered. When I finally left home for college, my parents turned my bedroom into a guest room. On my first holiday back, I asked them if the door still gave them trouble. My mother looked at me strangely and said, "No, not anymore. Not since you left." But when I slept there that night, the old rhythm returned. At exactly 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of the knob turning. The door creaked open as though it had been waiting for me all along. And from the hallway came those same deliberate steps, stopping just outside, holding their breath, waiting for mine. I never told my parents what happened that night. I never stayed in that room again. Even now, as an adult, when I close a door at night, I have to check it 3 times, sometimes more, to make sure it's shut. But deep down, I know it doesn't matter. Doors are meant to keep things out, but some things don't need permission to come in. And sometimes, they prefer to linger on the threshold, where all they need to do is wait. Story 3. The office storage room that opened from the inside. I used to work in an old downtown building, the kind of place that reeked of history and dust. It had once been a printing press in the early 1900s, then later an insurance company, before finally being gutted and turned into a cramped collection of law offices. I was fresh out of college, desperate for work, and had landed a junior clerk position that paid just enough to cover rent and ramen noodles. The building itself was a character. Cracked tile floors, brass railings dulled by decades of fingerprints, and long hallways with flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed louder than the sound of my own thoughts. But there was one part of it I couldn't stand: the storage room. The storage room sat at the very end of the 3rd floor hallway, tucked behind 2 locked fire doors no one ever seemed to use. It wasn't just any room. It was one of those spaces that felt off even before you stepped inside. It had no windows, smelled faintly of mold and machine oil, and was always just a few degrees colder than the rest of the building. My boss, Mr. Abernathy, warned me about it on my very first week. "Don't leave the door unlocked," he said in his gravelly smoker's voice. "And if you find it open, you call me first. Don't go in alone." At the time, I laughed it off. What was the worst that could happen? Maybe a rat had chewed through a box of old legal files. But there was something in his eyes, something tired, heavy, that told me he wasn't joking. The first few weeks passed without incident. I would occasionally fetch boxes of archived case files, always locking the heavy metal door behind me, always relieved when I stepped back into the fluorescent-lit hallway. Then, one Thursday evening in November, I stayed late to finish some filing. The office was dead quiet, every creak of the old building amplified in the silence. Around 9:30 p.m., I finished up and started down the hallway toward the elevators. That's when I noticed it. The storage room door was standing open, not just ajar, wide open, as if someone had swung it out and walked inside. My first instinct was that Mr. Abernathy must still be around. I leaned in, calling softly, "Hello?" "Mr. Abernathy?" Nothing. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, throwing the darkened doorway into an uneven strobe of shadows. The room itself was pitch black beyond the threshold. I could almost convince myself the darkness had weight, like a curtain hanging heavy just past the doorway. I swallowed hard, stepped closer, and reached for the doorknob. That's when it happened. The door slammed shut in my face. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stood frozen, staring at the now closed door. My first thought was that someone had been inside, that maybe a cleaning crew had gotten in, or worse, some homeless person was using the space as shelter. But then I remembered something that made my stomach drop. The door could only be locked and unlocked with a key. From the outside, I didn't have my key out, and I hadn't touched it. I bolted down the hallway and didn't stop until I was in the stairwell, breathless and sweating. The next morning, I told Mr. Abernathy what had happened. His face went pale, and he muttered something about, "Not again." When I pressed him, he finally told me what he knew. Years ago, long before our law firm occupied the floor, a young file clerk had been trapped in that very storage room. The lock mechanism had failed, and no one found him until 3 days later. He'd suffocated, pounding on the door until his hands bled. Some say that ever since, the room didn't like being disturbed. I didn't believe him. At least, I didn't want to. But the memory of that door slamming in my face stuck with me, gnawed at me every time I walked past the hallway. I told myself I'd imagined it, that maybe the draft from an open window had caused it to swing shut. Still, I never went near it alone again. Months later, I found myself working late once more. It was nearly midnight, the building eerily silent except for the groaning of pipes in the walls. I was about to head out when I heard it, the distinct metallic click of a lock turning. I froze. Slowly, I turned toward the end of the hallway. The storage room door was opening. There was no one in sight. No footsteps. No keys jangling. Just the heavy door, swinging outward in a deliberate slow arc until it yawned wide, revealing the suffocating blackness inside. I didn't wait this time. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the stairwell, my shoes slapping against the tile as something echoed behind me. Not footsteps exactly. More like a shuffling, dragging sound, as though someone, or something, was trying to follow. I quit that job the next week, told them I'd found a better opportunity. Maybe that was true, maybe not. All I know is that I still dream about that hallway sometimes, about that door slowly creaking open even when no one is there. And in those dreams, I never make it out in time. If you've made it this far, then you know the world is never as secure as we'd like to believe. A locked door isn't always a barrier, and sometimes what waits on the other side doesn't need a key at all. Whether it's the echo of a childhood memory, the silence of a hotel hallway, or the uneasy shift of air in an empty office, these stories remind us that doors may not only open to let us in, they may also open to let something out. And when they do, the question that lingers is simple yet terrifying. What else is moving freely among us, unseen and uninvited?